Thank you for your great questions. The first question I'm answering, are there specific events that caused the despair of the early 70s in Christian education? Something that was equivalent to the National Jewish Population Study 1990 that served as a wake-up call and then catalyst for change. This question meant that I had to go back to where I was in the 70s. I had just graduated from college and was working in White Plains, New York, at New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center, working with the most disturbed children and their families. I was also involved in ministries of education in two different churches. One was in the Bronx. It was called the Van Est Full Gospel Church, which was actually an Italian Assemblies of God congregation. And I, being Hispanic, was an outsider in that group, but taught the junior high class as well as the children's church, which meant I had children from kindergarten through 6th grade for typically an hour and a half, 2 hours during the worship service. Probably in the 70s, if I go back and remember that, and I didn't go to seminary until 1975, and then on to doctoral study after that. In terms of the field of Christian education, I think there were still reactions to the 1960s and the shifts that happened, at least in U.S. culture. Probably the dominant approach, though, to education during that time would be the approach of religious instruction that Jack Seymour discusses in his his book, Contemporary Approaches to Christian Education, and later in Mapping Christian Education. That would have typified the programs there. I think during the 60s there was a shift of persons leaving faith communities. So there were different efforts of churches to revisit their educational approach, and some national curriculum emerged. Following that, there was an effort entitled Christian Education Shared Approaches, where different denominations cooperated together to find common ground rather than their individually focused educational approaches in each of their churches. So those were some of the shifts that I think, not so much despair, but a revisiting of what would be possible and the need to pretty quickly, because of the cost, explore cooperative efforts, particularly in the publication of curriculum to guide Christian education. Second question that was posed for me here is continuity as much of a goal of education, Christian education, as it is in the Jewish community? Is it as big of a concern? I would say yes, that particularly when it has to do with how faith is transferred to future generations, both to children and youth and to families, particularly with high mobility in the U.S. setting, and how that plays out for maintaining a sense of religious identity. I think it's also come to bear, particularly now in the 21st century. It's been revisited again because of the emergence of those who are spiritual but not religious in their orientation. Some would even name it as Christians in spirituality, but not religious in terms of practicing connection with a direct faith community. Generally, in thinking about that, though, educators have thought the challenge is to balance both continuity and change. In fact, Elizabeth Molino Moore wrote a book on education as continuity and change, of how do we find a helpful balance across those two. And I think it varies depending upon whether one is in a more conservative church situation and denomination, if one is more progressive in orientation. Continuity is a priority for those who have a more conservative orientation in the Christian community, as compared with those who are more progressive, who want to address change to what's happening in the wider world, in the wider society. So the responses are going to vary depending upon one's theological perspective and whether one would see oneself in a conservative setting, which sometimes is named in the U.S. setting as being evangelical. And I taught for 5 years in an evangelical school, but in 1986 moved to Andover, Newton, which is known for being more in the progressive end of things. I think in my own approach educationally, I try to emphasize both the need for essentialism philosophically, which means there are certain basics and essentials that need to be transmitted in the Christian community, as well as being highly influenced by liberation theology and the place for transformation. How does faith get lived out in the wider society? The next question actually relates to the text on page 14, MacDonald suggesting about a problem that needs to be resolved, particularly relationship between inner and outer experience. I would not necessarily see that as a problem, but I think a continuous kind of interface for how do we help people make a connection between the inner world and the outer world, and see that faith helps us make that bridge and connection. Because I don't think it's enough that the culture have an impact upon a person, but that how they own that becoming important. And I'm trying to read through the question here. After all, it says there isn't one model. And I guess that would be the case, and it came up in our discussion in class today, that there are various models to approach the educational task, and seeing the complementarity of that as it relates to particular communities, groups of persons, and the particular history of where religious education is being practiced becomes important. The final question, and there may be follow-up questions that you might want to pose for me in light of my responses to what's checked off here. The final question is, I want to ask a similar question about the 5 approaches. Is there one approach that is dominant in the Christian education at this time? I guess probably it would be religious instruction would be the primary approach that's approached in most congregational settings as the way to find the most common denominator that can make a difference educationally, that people have to settle on one particular approach across the lifespan that can make a difference for people having a sense of identity within their community. The bigger challenge now, though, and this is suggested in the book God Beyond Our Borders, in that approach of religious instruction, how do we relate to people who are religiously different from us in the wider community? And to that extent, other approaches that stretch people, first of all, to identify their spiritual resources by considering spiritual formation, but also how does their faith relate to what's happening in the wider global community, and particularly what's happening in our national situation, would be the additional factor. I don't think there's one approach that has been dominant, and again, it would vary with the branches of Christianity, somewhat along those conservative over against progressive lines. I think in some progressive communities you'd have more of a press in terms of the role of transformation, and how that relates to the themes of what's happening in the political arena. The other approach that I think has taken on a character across both, I think, conservative and progressive communities would be the need for small group work and ministry, which emphasizes the importance of spiritual formation personally, that one would come in contact with God and have one nurture one's faith, and that how that would relate to all of life would be a movement that has impacted, I think, both, as I could see, both conservative as well as more progressive congregations.
Give us that phrase that you mentioned earlier, the purpose of religious education to
increase the love of God, neighbor, and all of creation would be my addition to what would be the focus on God and neighbor was traditional in Christian circles beginning in the 1950s for theological education. I would expand it in the light of the ecological global crisis to include creation, which Michael pointed out was probably implied in the earlier focus upon God and neighbor, but now it's just taken on a different character given what's happening in our world.
Thank you so much, Bob.
You're welcome.